very pleased to have Dr. Kleinig with us. He will tell you a lot of stories about his own connection with Hermann Sasse, both as a student and a pastor. But just a bit about Hermann Sasse's life. We think of him, of course, today as one of the great confessional Lutheran theologians and churchmen in the 20th century, and that he was. But I think it's also important to note that he did not start out in a confessional Lutheran context. Born in 1895, he was born into a congregation or to a family in Thuringia. Grew up in a nominally kind of cultural Protestant setting there. As a young man, went to the University of Berlin to study both theology and philology. And when he went to Berlin, the faculty at Berlin was dominated by some of the most prestigious theologians of the early 20th century, men like Adolf Harnack, Adolf Dietzmann, and Reinhold Schieberg, and especially also Karl Hohl and
Philomovitz.
Okay, Moritz. And so he was exposed to really what we would call kind of a cultural liberal Protestant theology. University studies interrupted during the First World War. He fights in the German army. He is part of a cohort that goes into the Battle of Passchendaele, and I think only about 5 or 6 men in that cohort actually survived, right?
Actually, can I come in there? He was an officer. He had a unit of 160 men, and in the terrible Battle of Passchendaele, they went from the trenches and 6 came back, and he was the one of those 6. And that scarred him for his life, for better and for worse. And he said, quite frankly, had 2 witticisms about. He said, "Liberalism died for me that day." And the other witticism he had was that this was my first contact with Australians, and I came out alive. Because he confronted some of our crack troops in this terrible battle, which was the German counterattack after we were being forced back. It was the last attack. And the other side, if I can just give a plug, he was facing one of our most brilliant military strategists, a man by the name of Monash. But that's just an Australian plug. You don't know Australian history.
Okay. After the war, he finishes his university studies. He's ordained in 1920, St. Matthew's Church in Berlin, which incidentally is the same church that Paul Tillich was ordained in, and the same church that Dietrich Bonhoeffer would be ordained in a few years later. By the way, with Bonhoeffer and Sasse, there's also a great connection there. Bonhoeffer was 11 years younger than Sasse, but they came from similar backgrounds, both studied at the University of Berlin, both came to America for an American year studies, and both would be involved together in opposition to National Socialism. The break between Bonhoeffer and Sasse would come with the Barmen Declaration of 1934. After he finishes his degree, he's married, 1924, and then for the academic year 1925-1926, he comes to Hartford Theological Seminary in Connecticut for a postgraduate year. That year will be very significant. It's during that year that he will meet a number of American Lutherans, primarily of the old United Lutheran Church in America, the Seminary in Philadelphia, where you had men like Henry Eister Jacobs and his son, Charles Jacobs, also Frederick Knubel, who was president of the ULCA at that time, and and particularly then Theodore Tappert, who will actually try to get Sasse to come and teach at the Mount Airy Seminary in 1939. That plan, however, was forestalled. Sasse's earliest book, or book that really is a piece he published in 1927 on American Christianity. And that book gives his impressions of the state of Christianity in America in the 1920s, and particularly his observations about the Lutheran churches here. Back in Germany, he is involved in the ecumenical movement. Dr. Kleinig and I were talking a bit after chapel, and I hope he develops this a bit in his comments, that Sasse was an ecumenical confessionalist and a confessional humanist. He took ecumenical responsibility very seriously. He was by no means a kind of a ghetto Lutheran, but he was speaking always also to the whole church. We see that very early on in his involvement in 1927, Lausanne Conference on Faith and Order. This kind of work will continue really through Sasse's life. But in 1933, he works with Bonhoeffer, with Georg Merz, with Wilhelm Fischer on the Bethel Confession. And it's also during that same year that he is called to the University of Erlangen to the faculty. 1934, refuses to write or to sign the Barmen Declaration. 1936, publishes one of his most significant and in many ways, I think, kind of programmatic books. Under the English title is Here We Stand. And that was translated already in the 1930s by Theodore Tappert and mailed to every Lutheran pastor in the old National Lutheran Council. It was seen as a way of introducing Lutheran theology to a broader American public. In 1945, after the war, he meets John Bacon, president of the Missouri Synod, when Bacon was visiting Germany, and that becomes a lifelong and influential point of contact and influence in so many ways. 1948, he resigns his membership in the Bavarian Church in disappointment and protest over that church entering into the Ecke, the Evangelical Lutheran Church in Germany, which he deemed to be a unionistic church body. There's another trail of stories that I don't have time to go into here today, but about preliminary contacts with Concordia Seminary in St. Louis and the potential of a call there in 1948. But instead, he is called to Emmanuel Lutheran Seminary in Adelaide, Australia, and installed there October 12, 1949. And Dr. Kleinig, I'm sure, will fill you in on all the details, or many of the details of the Australian chapter, because it is also during this Australian chapter that he has increased contacts with Lutherans in the United States, particularly within the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod, invited to come to the campus of this seminary when we were at Springfield as a guest lecturer, had a great love, I think, for this seminary during the Springfield days, and was also awarded an honorary degree from Concordia Theological Seminary in 1967. One of the aspects of the Australian chapter, which Dr. Kleinig can speak to, would be Sasse's involvement in the merger of two Lutheran church bodies in Australia that resulted in 1966 in the current Lutheran Church of Australia. Sasse then would live until 1976. He dies in a house fire, actually from fumes from a space heater, I think,
Yes.
a kerosene heater. If we think about, kind of Sasse's overall contributions, I would suggest there are several areas that you might want to be cognizant of and look at. One is the nature of confession itself. What does it mean to confess Jesus Christ? A second area would be ecclesiology. It is often said that in the 19th century, the burning question was the question of the church. Sasse immerses himself into that question. And there we see, I think, something really of Sasse's own theological method, which is determined by Article 7 of the Augsburg Confession. It is sufficient for the true unity of the church that the gospel be purely preached and sacraments administered in accordance with the divine word. Certainly the Lord's Supper, his great book on Luther's doctrine of the Lord's Supper, was really my first introduction to Sasse as a college student. This is my body. That was published in 1959. He also was very much involved in articulating what he believed to be a responsible doctrine of the authority of Holy Scripture. And that would be one of the areas that would create no little amount of controversy, and I think sometimes misunderstanding on the part of some of Sasse's opponents. But that's kind of a thumbnail sketch of Sasse's life, and so I'm going to turn it over to the one who was actually eyewitness, as I am only a Deutero-Sassian.
Okay. Okay. Thank you, John, and for that splendid overview. If you hearing that story, you could be rather intimidated because he was a formidable man in his learning and in his courage. One of the things you didn't touch on was that he was the first theologian, not just Lutheran, to tackle Nazi theology head on. In 1932, wasn't it?
Yeah.
The Nazi propaganda chief had issued a pamphlet, a book on German Christianity, which basically said Jesus was not a Jew, he was an Aryan, and was reaching and propagated this abomination of, this perversion of the Christian faith. And Sasse pens, as he so often did, a cutting, decisive critique of not Nazi politics, but Nazi theology. And from that moment on, he was a marked man. And it was a miracle, or a number of miracles, that he survived the Nazi period and the war. I won't go into that. There's lots of interesting stories there. But one of the most interesting one was because he was an officer in the First World War, he had friends in the German army, the Wehrmacht. And the most effective opposition to Hitler came actually from the army. And that Dietrich Bonhoeffer linked with that particular group in the army in an attempt to assassinate Hitler. But the army was not entirely happy with Hitler, to put it mildly. And so when he was in Erlangen, they appointed him as a military chaplain to a military hospital in Erlangen. Now, and that gave him military status, military cover. The Nazis couldn't touch him without getting into trouble with the army that they needed at that stage in the war. Okay, I say he's a formidable man, because if ever there was a truth sayer, a person who was prophetic and fierce in advocating the truth, and this, because of this, he fell out with many people. And if you look at the story of his life, because he, on the other hand, he was also a very warm, winsome, imaginative, witty person. And so he made friends easily and could reach out across all sorts of barriers. But then inevitably, he'd fall out with people because he told the truth. So he's a formidable character. But what people don't realize, and what you don't pick up when you read him, is his wit. He was very, very wickedly witty, and had a wicked wit. And his one-liners were memorable, and I wish I'd written them down. But just to give you some idea of the man. Okay, let's say this was one, I remember one class, a church history class. And there were about, a dozen of us or 15 of us in a fairly small classroom. And there was a podium like this, about this size, and it was about as deep as this, and it was enclosed at three sides. And Sasse would come in with a great big pile of books. He'd clomp because, as he said, I lost my feet in the trenches. He'd come in with this great big pile of books, hardly any of them in English. And in most cases, he wouldn't open a single one. He'd plonk them down and he'd start lecturing, raising his finger as soon as he hit the door. Okay, so on this one occasion, a student, a rather cheeky student, decided to test him and play a joke on him because he was, would make fun of us and tell jokes against our expense. And the name of the guy was Hans. And he got into the back of this podium. If you can imagine, it's about this deep, and there's enough for crouching underneath this. And Sasse would sit like this. Now, he'd rock like this, and he'd lift his hand, and he'd constantly wave his finger, to emphasize everything. And everything was emphatic. We could barely contain ourselves because he got particularly worked up this day, excited. And then what Hans would do, as soon as he'd go back, he'd shift the podium, he'd get up a little bit this way. And what did Sasse do? So in the course of that lecture, Hans took the podium as far as he dared, 3 times across. And he was over this side when the bell rang at the end of the lecture. And Sasse, this is the only occasion it ever happened, Sasse stopped mid-sentence, very dramatically, pushed back the chair, and in an exaggerated fashion, he looked down and he said, Hans, you can come out now. Yes, he wasn't at all pompous or, as we say in Australia, up himself. A very humble man, but a truth teller. On another occasion, I could tell lots of stories, but one of my favorites, he would welcome questions. On one occasion, one day, a student said, this may be a stupid question, but. Okay, and he made a big point and he said, he always called him Mr. Swa. Only stupid people don't ask questions. There are no stupid questions. And he had the knack of taking questions, which were, could be very superficial, and finding something profound in them and making the most of it. A marvelous ability to think on his feet. And he would never speak from notes. He'd just speak off the cuff. A marvelous memory. But after that had happened, then we dared the guy who had asked that question the next lecture to ask what we call a Dorothy Dix, which is a leading question. And we thought Sasse would not be able to make anything of this. And so the next day, the next lesson, we got into class and, he got going, and Kevin, the guy, put up his hand and said, Dr. Sasse, I have a question. And he said, good. What's your question, Mr. Swa? And he said, look, I've got a girlfriend. Oh, that's interesting. You've got a girlfriend, yes. and we go to church together. Oh, that's good. That's even better. And he said, no, we sit together in church, but we were wondering whether it would be right to hold hands in church. And Sasse's face set. He raised his bushy eyebrows and put on a fierce demeanor, lifted up his finger, and he said, Mr. Twor, it would be very, very wrong for you not to hold hands. That was the only occasion when he answered a question with a single sentence. Yes. Another little incident of a different character, because he was not only a very, very learned man. He was widely read. He didn't just read theology. He read science. He read philosophy. He was a historian. He read dogmatics. Amazingly widely read. But what doesn't always come through in his writings is that he's also a brilliant pastor, but not a mushy pastor. He could just very simply get to the heart of the matter. He had that gift. I remember one occasion, after a lecture, I accompanied him as he was going from the lecture hall through to the library, carrying his stack of books. And I sidled up to him and wanted to seek his advice. Now, I noticed that something was happening in my life that was, and it happened particularly when I came to seminary, is that when I try to pray or meditate, my mind, which always wanders and races around the place, would just go this way, that way, everywhere. And particularly in church and listening to a sermon. And the funny thing about it was that my mind would not just wander when it was a bad sermon because it was bad and boring, but sometimes the best sermons would get my mind racing, and I'd be distracted by it. And I assumed this was a bad thing and was coming from the other spirit. So I was walked with Sasse and said, look, Sasse, Dr. Sasse, I've got a problem. And Sasse stopped, faced me, and he said, good. And it's the first time I ever heard anybody say a problem was good. He says, good. What's your problem, Kleinig? And I said, look, whenever I attend church, listen to a sermon, I seem to be distracted by the devil. And it's really very difficult to, when I try and meditate or pray, it's hard for me to follow. I seem to have the devil seems to distract me. He looked at me and said, the devil? He said, perhaps it is the Holy Spirit. And then he walked away. In its own way, that was one of the most helpful bits of spiritual counsel I've ever received, as some of you may know, because I speak about it in my book, Grace Upon Grace. Okay, a very witty, incisive man, but he could also be devastating. He could put people down with a one-liner if he chose to. And sometimes he made enemies because of his one-liners. He was very adept at, he's not, he was basically, if you like, a theological journalist. He comes to his own best of all in writing letters and writing short articles. Okay. So much. Oh, another story. Okay, because lots of this other stuff you can pick up elsewhere, but these kinds of stories you are not recorded. Another day, it was church history class again, early church, and we had two guys in our class who were joke tellers. They had an amazing memory for jokes. And they'd say, have you heard the latest? And they'd tell a joke. And it was good to get them together because they'd fire each other off. Joke one, joke two, and that kind of stuff. That's an art that's been lost, I think, that joke telling. They weren't just joke tellers, but they were connoisseurs. Am I speaking too fast? Can you hear me at the back? Okay. They were connoisseurs of limericks. And this day, Peter, who was in that class, who always come into class late and would always sit at the very back corner. That was his position. And if anybody went there, they got into trouble. He was a second career guy, had come into class, and he'd just discovered a delicious limerick. It's a little bit on the rude side, as the best limericks are. Now, and for just to fill you in historically, because it was you need some background to it. Titian is a great Italian painter, and he used to like painting nude women or semi-nude women. And rose madder is a particular shade, rose-colored shade, which he would use then to get the flesh tone. And the limerick goes like this. You better listen to the punchline. While Titian was mixing rose madder, his model stood perched on a ladder. Her position to Titian suggested fruition. So he mounted the ladder and had her. I shouldn't really tell it here, but it's part. Apologies to you, dear ladies. He'd written it out on a piece of paper, and we were on tables like this, and then one person read it, and then when Sasse didn't seem to be looking, you'd slip it, and then it would go. And then it came to the end of the row, and you had to get across the aisle. So somehow underhand, you'd signal, and it was doing the rounds. And Sasse was talking about the persecution of the early church in North Africa. And he was telling a story about how the secret police, the Roman secret police, came to visit the house of one of the bishops in North Africa. The point they wanted, ostensibly, they wanted to confiscate the scriptures, but what they wanted to do was to confiscate the offerings, the money that had been collected. Okay, so they came to this bishop and they asked him, where do you store your treasures? And the bishop said, I have no treasures. I have no money. But he had received word that the police were on the way. And so he put his collection of heretical writing of heretics, in what he thought was the most obvious place where the police would look. But Sasse said, they turned the house upside down, emptied the beds, emptied the cupboards. And meanwhile, whenever they came to the room where this chest was with the books in it, the bishop would stand as if he was defending it. And finally said, the penny dropped. And the policeman said, what have you got there? And he pointed straight to the guy who had the limerick. There was a stunned silence, followed by uproarious laughter. And we never actually discovered whether it was a sheer accident. It could have been that. But I think he jolly well knew. On a more... I've been talking. Yes.
No, great.
This is what you want?
This is what we want. I mean, there are all kinds of Sasse stories that I've heard from John Kleinig and from others. His wit. I was telling John one that I had heard I think probably from Lowell Green, who was at Erlangen as a student in the post-war years. And Sasse was the American or the liaison to the American Army for the denazification of the university. And so the question was put to him, what about your colleague, Dr. Paul Althaus? And Sasse responded, well, Herr Dr. Althaus could not possibly be a Nazi because as a good Melanchthonian, he could neither affirm or deny anything. Althaus was not amused.
And there was another witticism about Althaus. He was a very vain man who used to give out photographs of himself.
Colleagues like that.
You didn't say that.
No, I didn't say that.
And he retained, and even to middle age and so on, a very boyish face. And Sasse is put down about that was that he never lost his confirmation face. In other words, he never grew up. It's better in German than in English. Yeah.
We have a little time left, and there might be some questions and
Yes.
From our audience. But before we go there, you've lived now as pastor in Lutheran Church of Australia. You're an heir of this wonderful legacy of Hermann Sasse. Talk a little about his theological legacy. Why is it that you think Sasse is still worth reading and reflecting on today, and particular aspects maybe of his work that stand out for you?
Yes. One thing that I'd emphasize is that he deals with not so much the topics of academic of the university and academic theology, but he deals with real practical issues. In the 60s, when I was in seminary, the Pentecostal movement had barely raised its head. And he's quite a prophetic figure. And he said again and again, the unfinished part of church doctrine history is the whole third article. He says, you look at any dogmatics, they don't do justice to the third article. And that all the most important topics that would be at the forefront in the second half, the latter part of the 20th century and 21st century would have to do with the third article, the Holy Spirit, the gifts of the Spirit, scripture, inspiration, ministry, church, sacraments, means of grace, all that kind of stuff. And he gave me as an assignment to do some work on the Assemblies of God, which were just beginning to come in Australia. And so at that stage, he steered in that direction, and I had to come to grips with the whole Pentecostal theology of the charismata. Now, that was typical of him. He wouldn't go to what was fashionable, the topics that everybody was engaged with, but he was trying to anticipate, and he had the remarkable ability to anticipate what would be important in the future. Okay, and he was ecumenical in a way that is people don't realize. He had contacts right from Cardinal Bayer, who was second in charge in the Vatican and was the brains behind the Second Vatican Council, through to evangelical Anglicans. That people would write off as being fundamentalists. He had this enormous reach. And there's two things that strike me in addition to that. And it wasn't a superficial understanding. Just on the Second Vatican Council, it was going on when I was at seminary. And it gave Sasse a new lease of life. Because already before reports of what was happening there hit the media, he would get a letter from Cardinal Bayer or his secretary up to date, so much so that the Catholic bishops, whom he all knew, would ask him, what's happening in Rome? And he was able to brief them, and quite accurately. And he saw that this was probably the most, he says, this was the most momentous event in the 20th century, Vatican II. Not just for the Catholic Church, but for the whole of Christendom. And he had great hopes for it. Finally disappointed, and particularly because of its universalism, finally. But he had that ecumenical curiosity and reach and understanding. There are two things that stick in my mind that I learned from him. This is ecumenically. One is that he says again and again to us as students, we shouldn't just read our friends because they agree with us and we agree with them. We can't learn very much from them. But we need to read our enemies. They teach us far more than the people who are on the same page as us. To be widely read and to understand people from a different position. They challenge us. They challenge us to think. They show us where we are somehow lacking in our understanding of the faith or the scriptures or church history. And in that respect, he gave a second dictum, which is that before you dare to criticize somebody, make sure you understand them. And not just understand them in a narrow sense, but make sure you understand them within their own frame of reference. So you've got to step in their shoes and, in a sense, read them and listen to them, not as Lutherans, but as, say, Presbyterians or Catholic or Pentecostals. So step in their shoes, understand them in their own terms, and then you can criticize them or engage with them in a measured way and not from a point of view of ignorance. Now, that has stuck with me ever since, and it's something that I've tried to practice very hard in my life, which is what I'd call, contrary to what's fashionable in academia, a hermeneutic of appreciation. You don't say, what's wrong with this person? What do I have to criticize here? But what is right? And Sasse would say again and again to take note of new movements within Christendom, because he says when the Orthodox Church forgets one of the articles of faith, when it no longer practices them, it'll be rediscovered by some fringe group, very often a sectarian group. And we need to learn from that because they show us what we have forgotten and what we need to reclaim. Take, for example, the Pentecostal movement. The first part of my dogmatics was basically we never got to the third article because we concentrated mainly on first article and second article, no third article. However, when I graduated, all the basic problems were third article problems, and particularly the whole issue of the Pentecostal movement. So to take note of fringe movements that rise because they discover and emphasize in a one-sided kind of way something that the Church Catholic, the small Catholic Church, has forgotten. And we can learn a great deal from them, and we must note this. And in addition to this, he would emphasize, so don't just look at the big boys, the big movements, the big churches. Look at those little ones. They're significant. You can learn a lot from them. The other thing that he emphasized ecumenically was that all the great movements in church history are ecumenical. They cut across all denominations at the same time. And it's funny, the same questions seem to rise from all the way from orthodoxy through to heretical groups. All the great movements are ecumenical, and they need to be treated and understood ecumenically. So take, for example, the ordination of women. No, that was never on the agenda until, say, 50 years ago, I suppose, and then became one of the pressing issues. The whole sexual issue at the moment is not just ecumenical across the denominations theologically, but is across the whole of our society. And it's how those two quite often correspond. The big movements across the churches and the big movements in society, and they interact with each other. So to understand that you can't isolate yourself from the big movements in the church across the churches, you need to take note of them. And then he give advice. He says, look, there's two ways basically you deal with a movement across the church that is not exactly right, it's false teaching. You can quarantine the body from it. And he'd point to Missouri Synod, and he said from its very creative early beginnings, basically it tended to set in cement at a particular period. And they ceased to buy, and he went to the seminary library in St. Louis, and he said they were no longer buying the books written by other theologians that they should be buying. And even if they had them there, they weren't being read. He said, you can try and quarantine, say, a denomination or church from false doctrine. But the problem is, if you quarantine it, it becomes even more vulnerable to it. And the analogy that he used was of a body. You can quarantine the body from infection, but the problem is then the body becomes more vulnerable to infection. It loses its antibodies. And he says, once a disease, heresy is a disease, comes into the body of a church, it needs to take its full course before the church can develop antibodies. So if you apply that, that makes good sense to me and helps me in understand lots of things that are going on, and not to try and put certain questions out of consideration. If I can just illustrate two cases, the whole issue of the ordination of women is ecumenical and is affecting all denominations in some way. In a sense, you can try and silence debate or discussion on this, but that doesn't help very much if you silence discussion. That needs to take its full course. People need to see the consequences of this before it can be turned around. And that's the same with the whole sexual agenda. So that's a very helpful dictum of his about the way you approach movements in church history. Just one other thing. One of the things that strikes me, even though he was a truth teller like no other, he was very generous in his appraisal of other people. He had a real generosity of spirit, and occasionally he laments the fact that he's always got to go into negative mode because that didn't come naturally to him. His natural tendency was to see what was good rather than to see what was bad. A generous heart.
We have a few minutes left, and one thing that might be helpful before we end today is for you to talk a little about the two Lutheran groups in Australia, their background, and how Sasse was really a catalyst for bringing those two Lutheran groups together in 1966. Could you do that?
Yes. Sasse was not enamored by size, magnitude. And he said the significance of a particular church or denomination doesn't depend on its membership. He says the most significant things happen in the smallest congregations, the smallest churches. When when his situation in Erlangen became intolerable, that's another whole story. He was looking to come over to either Australia or to America or Australia. He was most drawn to the LCMS, and to his dying day, he said the future of confessional Lutheranism stands or falls with LCMS. And I'd like to lay that on you. You're far more important for confessional Lutheranism, but also for the Church Catholic, the whole of Christendom, than you ever imagine. If you lived where I lived, you would understand that. But that's by the way. What was I talking about?
The two Lutheran bodies.
Oh, the two Lutheran bodies. Okay, then there was a call didn't come to St. Louis, but then at the same time that he was exploring options, he got a call to Adelaide and to one of the two synods that was there, the UELCA, that's my synod, which was aligned with over here with the old ALC.
That's
yours.
Yeah.
And not only that, but one of the great heroes or fathers of that synod was Willem Leu.
Yeah.
And August Filmer, two great Lutheran theologians that you need to understand.
I would just interject one thing here. It was in the year at Hartford.
Yes.
Sasse read Wilhelm Ley's 3 books about the church. And he says, that is the book that made me a confessional Lutheran.
That's right.
And he would have his own set of criticisms of Ley.
Oh, he had criticisms of everybody, including himself.
but he did see Ley as one who kind of braved the climate of the 19th century without becoming sectarian, remaining a very Catholic spirit and embodying both Lutheran confession and practice.
Yeah, because he wasn't just interested in doctrine, but he was interested in worship, sacraments, and he was interested in mission. And he was one of the most pastoral of any. I mean, if there is a model pastoral theologian, for me it is Willem Leu. So there was the one church, the UELCA, aligned with ALC and aligned with Bavarian Lutheran Church. We're in fellowship with that. And then there was the other one, the ELCA, which was basically came out of Leipzig, the Leipzig mission, and was aligned with Missouri here. The first church was in LWF. The other one was not in LWF. Now, Sasse came to Australia partly because he felt the call to work towards the union of these two churches. He could see what was valuable and important in both of them, and that their two heritages needed to come together to complement each other, each other's weaknesses, and for a united Lutheran witness, not just to Australia. But he, as a historian, could see the strategic importance of Australia. We are a European outpost in Southeast Asia. And his vision was that Australia would be the island as in England and Ireland, of Southeast Asia, and would be the base for the conversion and the mission of the church to Asia. Just as the Irish monks then were responsible for the planting of the church in England and in Germany and in Northern Europe. So he worked towards, and his passion was to bring those two churches together, not just in a political union, but in a confessional union, where nothing was put under the carpet, but issues were thrashed out. And he was the leading, one of the leading figures in that process of union. And you can read the results of it in our theses of agreement. But it was not, and he used the methodology of the formula of Concord. You wouldn't deal with big issues. You'd deal with one issue at a time that was controverted, and you deal with it scripturally and confessionally in order to get a consensus. And one of the things that he emphasized was that consensus is not the same as uniform understanding or uniform even theology. Within a common confession, you could have a number of different points of view that were necessary to complement each other. I better not. Yes, we're running out of time. But just briefly, in understanding of church, you have the old Missourian understanding of church is basically congregation. Is church congregation? Is that right? Yeah, absolutely right. But church is more than just local congregation. Each congregation is part of the heavenly congregation, the heavenly assembly. And the church is not just local, but it is also regional and worldwide. So you have church in that broader sense, in which there's only one church, Ephesians, around the world, as well as many congregations. Now, both of those emphases need to supplement each other. And if they don't, the church runs into problems. That was part of his methodology. And say, for example, as far as ministry is concerned, he followed the same thing. There's not total sort of everybody on the same page, but everybody shared the same confession of faith. That was his goal. And that's a goal that you need to pursue too, ecumenically, in your relationship with other Lutheran bodies, and also with non-Lutheran bodies. Can I just alert you to something that I'm finding that many confessional Lutherans are not found these days in Lutheran churches? Can I repeat that? Many confessional Lutheran pastors, theologians, lay people are not members of any Lutheran church, but members of other churches. That's the old denominations are breaking down as confessional bodies. There's new configurations. God's doing something new. And the old confessional bodies are breaking down in the mission fields, which means that we need to negotiate a new reality historically and culturally and into the future.
I think this is a good point to wrap things up because we are at the top of the hour. I will put in a plug on the basis of what Dr. Kleinig said about finding Lutherans in other places for a convocation we're going to have here on Wednesday, October 24, a conservative Anglican theologian by the name of J.D. Cook, who wrote a wonderful thesis at the Humboldt University in Berlin on law and gospel as basis and boundary for theology. And when you read this, you think you're reading a Lutheran because you are.
You are reading a Lutheran.
Because he just happens to be, an Anglican in an Anglican church, but he's
confessionally
Lutheran. Yeah. And we have all kinds of opportunities, I think, to engage in this kind of interchange today. And Sasse is certainly a very good role model, I think, for us there. Once again, I want to thank you, my good friend, Dr. Kleinig, for being here with us.
Together.